Hey, so this is part 3 in my series on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, latest edition, DSM-5. And this video is on the brain theory, the brain chemical imbalance theory, and where that comes from. Because obviously it's a false theory. We know this is false. However, it is very cherished. So I'm just going to tell you the source, where it originally came from, and then you can go and research that for yourself and make up your own mind on it. So there's 2 individuals related to that topic. First one is a psychiatrist called Willem Grissinger. Now, he's discussed in this book. Again, this is in the Internet Archive, 1956. You can download it. This is on page 56. And Grissinger was a psychiatrist, German psychiatrist, obviously. And here it is stated, there is no doubt in his mind that the brain is the seat of mental diseases, although it has not yet been possible to discover specific brain damage corresponding to individual mental disorders. So this is around 1860s, 70s, right? Now, in this other book, which is a fantastic book called Psychiatrist, the Men Behind Hitler, I'm going to do different videos on that because it's got thousands of references in there and hundreds of names of people, dates. It's a biggie. It's a biggie. But in that book, it does confirm as well, same thing with Grissinger, on page 30. It says, as late as the 1870s, psychiatry and neurology were 2 separate and distinct disciplines. If you watch my other videos, psychiatry really at the time was only related to lunacy and looking after madhouses. So it was only becoming some sort of subject, well, trying to infiltrate medicine really is what was happening. But as late as 1870, psychiatry and neurology were 2 separate and distinct disciplines, neurology being its own medical field at the time, obviously, per the definition of neurology. In 1865, however, psychiatrist Willem Grissinger left his job as head of a medical clinic in Zurich to accept a similar position at a psychiatric clinic in Berlin, where he could pursue a combination of psychiatry and neurology. The result was a new and profound idea. Since most of the nerves converge in the brain, then all mental illnesses must be diseases of the brain. And obviously this conclusion, without any proof, without any scientific research, nothing, this is really out of the mind of Willem Grissinger, who came up with this idea, because he was just convinced it was in the brain. So that was the first part. Then Grissinger went on to actually combine neurology, which at the time was just a medical discipline, combine it with mental health. And the book explained this in details, but I want to go on to the next person because I'm limited on time. Now, that was around 1865 to 1870. Now, shortly after, we come across Wilhelm Wundt. Many people will have heard of Wundt, but what they may not realize was, and I'm just going to simply read the sections purely because it's very, very clear, it's very definite, and you can then from that go and research yourself. So there's got exact dates and data. Now, what people don't realize is Wilhelm Wundt was not a medical doctor. He was a professor of philosophy, right? And if you watch my other videos on the original definition of psychology, at the time, psychology was a discipline of philosophy. It was a study of the soul, you know, not the mind, just the spirit, the soul, you know, consciousness, perception, how people perceived from a spiritual perspective. That's why it came under the field of philosophy. Okay, and it's always been that way for thousands of years. The idea of a soul, whether you have a soul or are a soul or don't have a soul, this is a very personal belief or based on observation or no observation or just faith. But that's definitely not something that somebody can just declare and say there is no soul. You know, it just doesn't work like that. Not in this civilization that we live in as human beings with the right to think. Anyway, he was actually a professor of philosophy. But here's the thing, he was very interested in psychology. That was, you know, what he taught a lot. And he said Wundt became so enthralled with the study of psychology as a separate subject that in 1879 he established his own psychological lab where he had the freedom to conduct experiments and demonstrations. And he established the first experimental psychology lab at the University of Leipzig in Germany. But here's the catch. At the time, psychology was the study of the soul. However, a psychiatrist, E.G. Boring, paid tribute to Wundt and says, Wundt is a senior psychologist in the history of psychology. He is the first man who, without reservation, is properly called a psychologist. Before him, there had been psychology enough, but no psychologist. But here's where it's gone wrong. With a degree in philosophy, Wundt was never a medical doctor, okay? Now, to him, it was not possible to study anything if it could not be sensed, measured, and experienced in the physical universe. Scientific demonstration demanded observable and quantifiable results. Seeing no hope of being able to do this with the human soul, Wundt changed the subject of psychology around to suit the needs of his view of science. From Wundt forward, psychology would not concern itself so much with the study of the soul, but with the study of observable phenomena related to human behavior. And just like that, from a study of the soul, which at the time definitely couldn't be measured, but it's certainly there, because it could not be measured or they didn't have the tools to measure it, he declared that there was no soul. That's fundamentally what happened. And the whole concentration went onto human behavior. And if you watch my other videos, you see that definition changing in the dictionaries. But that's where it comes from. 100% it comes from there. Because the lab that Wundt was given was initially small, but the whole subject boomed. You had people from all over the world, well, the Western world, coming to Wundt to study with him, including the first American psychologist called James Cattell, which I will cover in other videos because he's the man that began the destruction of American education, you know, in cahoots with Rockefeller and so on and so forth. Right, so now, just a couple more things. Wundt's data gathering technique centered around the scientific measurement of physiological reaction to given stimuli. This, he claimed, would result in an understanding of how people experience sensation. So we're looking at literally, you know, a stimulus response, which is what psychology uses now, isn't it? Like mass control. You give a stimulus and you get a response. So this is how it's controlled. Now, he says here, observation of the fact of consciousness is of no avail until these are derived from chemical and physical processes. Thought is simply a result of brain activity. Since this activity ceases when circulation is arrested and life departs, and that tells you already straight away what's wrong with it. If life departs, what is departing? You see? So even in his own text, he's contradicting himself. If life departs, so what is life? You see? The soul, eh? Maybe. But the point is, it contradicts himself. So, since this activity ceases when circulation is arrested and life departs, thought is nothing more than a function of the substances of which the brain is composed. The most clearly marked and most permanent of these mental disturbances are the various kinds of insanity. Basically, in other words, in believing that all thought is derived from chemical reactions in the brain, Wundt completely denied the existence of the soul. Man, according to Wundt, was a stimulus response animal, nothing more than a pattern of responses based upon past experience as translated through chemical processes. And sadly, many people then followed suit, including Ivan Pavlov, you know, the dog experiments, many other individuals, which are actually covered in this book, but I don't have enough time to go over that. So here you go. Take that, go and research it. But the brain theory and the brain chemical imbalance comes down strictly to that point in 1879 with Wundt and just before with Grisinger.